Welcome to the Emerging Biotech Leader, where we help biotech leaders maximize the value of their therapeutics from translational development to product launch. We're your hosts. I'm Kim Kushner.
And I'm Ramin Farhood. We are here to help you navigate the pitfalls of the biotech industry and illuminate the path forward.
Welcome to today's episode of the Emerging Biotech Leader. I'm so glad to welcome today Adriana Valenciano, one of our senior vice presidents at SSI, to really talk about what it takes to build an outcomes-driven biotech. We're going to talk about three key themes that are really interesting and really build off the last episode with Doug Locke and Johan Stromquist. We're going to talk about what it takes to plan for a global approach and globalization in your biotech from the earliest stages of development. Think about the cross-discipline or multidisciplinary approach to defining milestones and outcomes for your business. And lastly, think about the different kinds of skills that you'll need at each one of these stage gates for growth of the business overall. Adriana, thanks so much for joining today.
Thank you for having me, Kim. I'm glad to be back on the podcast.
Love to have you. So to start us out for the conversation, I'd love to maybe just opine with you on what it even means to have an outcomes-driven approach for building your biotech. I think everyone in the industry would hope that they're doing that. Intentionally, not intentionally, I'm not entirely sure, but maybe if you could give a perspective on what that even means, and we can build a conversation off that.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's a great topic to parlay from what we heard from Doug and Johan, who really honed in on just the change churn that exists as a part of building and operating a biotech. And so being intentional and outcome driven is just is a paramount a paramount skill that a lot of leaders they try and be intentional about as they're establishing these organizations. And I think outcomes for a lot of people means meeting milestones. So hitting that next clinical milestone, CMC milestone, et cetera. And that's one way of looking at it. But I think it's also about maybe the culmination of outcomes and achieving something that is more than just the bringing together of one discipline and one win. So I think about it as, going to a regulatory interaction and bringing together your points of view on your product, on your clinical story, and who your patient is and what unmet medical need you're solving, and coming back to that and saying, we got great feedback. There's buy-in. Like that to me is an intentional outcome. Like that's something that is like, we thought about the end in mind. We thought about the patient. We thought about how do we get there and tell that story with our clinical trials. We thought about how this product will be administered. What are the components of it and how it will be, brought to our patients. So I think it's about the culmination of these different types of milestones and having some real outcomes come out of it. Now we can do something with that. We can do something moving forward. We can kick off our clinical program. We could start looking at CROs. So that's kind of how I look at it, not just like one step at a time. It's when all of those things kind of come together and you're able to, through a multidisciplinary approach, achieve something that can translate into action for your organization.
I want us to come back to the multidisciplinary approach in a moment, but before we do so, if we can even think about the biggest goal. In most biotechs that we're working with, the number one goal that you ask in its philosophical sense is we want to get our drug to market. We want to get our product in the hands of patients who need it, period. What that often means, if they're a US-based company, we obviously have the largest market potential, at least kind of in the developed world financially, to launch in the US first. So the default is we're going to run our trials in the US or kind of in multiple regions that will get us an FDA approval first. We're going to engage with FDA first. This is the path. But what we've learned, and I love your experience here, is that it's not always the fastest way to market to get to the US. And so is the US actually the best option? And how are you seeing different biotech organizations answer the question, what is the fastest way to get to market?
Yeah, I think that, I mean, it's a great question. And I think we face this all the time at SSI with our clients as they're thinking of their go-to-market strategies. And, you're right. The path that most people take is US first and of late, US only, which is really too bad. I think that every once in a while you have a client that's thinking about other regions or companies that are thinking about other regions, maybe because they've seen it done before, maybe because they know there are some economic advantages to a certain region. But it's always based on, I would say, more of a, some sort of benefit, not necessarily like intentional about the overall global strategy. So I think that with a lot of our clients and with biotech in general, there should be sort of this step back of, yes, the US is always going to be sort of a part of our strategy, but what are the other regions that are going to create more of a strategic platform for this product? So are you thinking about, maybe going to Canada? Maybe for that disease area, there's really great centers or centers of excellence or a great patient population. What does that look like as a part of our global strategy? For a lot of companies, that's a really easy step forward because the requirements are very similar and you have access to greater patient populations. For other companies, they need to be thinking about regions outside of North America. And that could be for a number of different optionality. A lot of companies going into pediatrics are considering going into Europe first instead of the US because there are different requirements there. So I think it's about, of course, understanding your patient population, but understanding what the global regulatory landscape could be for your product, for your patients, and what regulators are really focused on in these different regions. I think that there's probably a whole other, podcast that'll talk about, the economic benefits of some of these other regions and the reimbursement things. But, from my perspective, when I'm thinking about like a development strategy, like there are a lot of advantages to approaching it, with different parallel strategies, thinking about maybe a leader and then a follower or something in parallel. And that'll just depend on really what the advantages in that region, specific to your patient population, your therapeutic area, et cetera. And there's also just a lot of really great incentives as well that can be offered from other parts of the globe. And if you're a biotech and you don't have necessarily all the money in the world to spend on these programs, you should be thinking about that as well. There are regions that will offer those incentives. And that to me is a really smart strategic decision that a company can make to move faster and be more efficient with their funding.
I think that last point is probably one of the most critical ones that industry leaders are facing right now. How to be most efficient with your capital, knowing that the capital environment is really challenging. We have to prove that we're demonstrating traction, but you need the capital in order to prove it. So you're in this chicken or egg scenario, and the number one goal is speed. And so the idea of stopping to figure out a global development strategy feels like it really should be a secondary or tertiary priority for these leaders, when in actuality, and we're seeing great success in the organizations that are thinking this way, it should really be a primary priority and step one in figuring out how do we want to build our corporate strategy and how does that trickle down to our development strategy, and what is the intersection of the variables we need to consider for that very outcomes-driven approach, and really the intentionality about defining what those outcomes really are.
Yeah. And I think it's all about even, thinking about how do we set ourselves up for success to take that global step when we are ready. And I think that's what a lot of companies don't do at that very early stage. And as you were saying, it's considered tertiary to go global. That's usually where it is. Like, we will get to that. Let's get this done first in the US and then we'll move on. But there are some easy intentional steps that you can take in the beginning, creating a global dossier versus just a US centric, briefing document. Like simple things that you can do and set yourself up early. Just start thinking about, these are the CMC requirements that we have here. They're almost the same here. let's just think about these things. Let's start talking about them so that we are not retrofitting our strategy to another region that, lo and behold, a year later, we realize this would be a really good place for us to go next. I'm working with a client now who is, they're finishing their phase 2, and they realize they'd like to go into Europe. And they have had amazing data. They have great success in their phase 2, and they find themselves in a situation where they don't know the clinical landscape at all in Europe. They know that their competitors are at all the sites that they potentially could. They don't even know if their current CRO could provide global services to them. So it's a huge disadvantage for them. They're starting really anew in terms of that European strategy, because they're saying to themselves, okay, I created this whole big, data package, US focused, US centric. Now I need to go back and say, what are the European requirements for, what are the endpoints that they're going to care about? Do I need to change my phase 3 trial design because there's an endpoint that they're going to emphasize more, or a PRO that is just, we never accounted for in our phase 2 because we didn't think about it. So, it's in practicality, it can really take you a step back if you're not careful in that early planning and kind of globalization of your strategy.
One of the things that, at least in my experience, I think has slowed organizations that are really trying to drive towards these outcomes is what you started with at the onset, which is thinking about each milestone and each outcome as a multidisciplinary problem. Because of the silos that naturally exist in the functions that you build within a biotech, we find that each function operates every problem as their own independent issue, and their outcomes or their milestones as independent issues. So, a phase 2 and a phase 2 meeting is a regulatory problem. Well, it's really not just a regulatory problem. It's regulatory and clinical, and a whole host of individuals across the business who need to weigh in and who need to be able to tell this really eloquent story about what you've done and where you're going. And that's true for most major milestones and most major outcomes that a biotech is driving towards. I'd love your opinions on how we separate the functional structures within the business and really start to operate as a multidisciplinary team so that we can fully recognize and appreciate the synergies of the skills and the backgrounds that are being offered and how that applies to getting these assets to market. Do you have some experiences you can lend on there?
Yeah, no, absolutely. And it actually it sometimes is a little bit of a pity when you are working with some smaller organizations, because they are small. So you assume that there's going to be a lot of connectivity across, the disciplines and how people collaborate. And, probably 90% of the time, that's probably the case. You hear about these, very cross-discipline teams, cross-functional teams, and ways of working to make sure that there is that interconnectivity. But that doesn't really account for how you plan kind of organizational wide. So if I'm a ClinOps leader, I'm going to be focusing on the things I need to do to execute on my part of the strategy. And I'm going to collaborate with my colleagues, but I'm also going to be really focused on, the intentions and goals of my function and my discipline. And I think it's, it takes good leaders to make sure that the disciplines are working together. But it also takes, some I would say foresight and flexibility to ensure that you're giving the team and allowing the team to build alternative strategies, alternative scenarios that can bring them all to success. And I was thinking of a recent example with a biotech that we have been working with, where they really had a really interesting strategy, and they were really focused on bringing their product to the clinic via a platform, a clinical trial platform. And it was something that they had built that decision, that clinical decision, into their investor story, into their corporate strategy, into their budget, So you can imagine how that cascaded to every single function. Okay, so we're working through a platform. We don't need a ClinOps per se. What do we do with pharmacovigilance? Is that going to be handled by, this platform? All these decisions, coming into play based on one corporate move. And it turns out they went to the regulators and they were like, we love this platform, but for your product, we don't think it makes sense. And you're better off doing this trial on your own. And so you can imagine sort of the rollback of each of those, disciplinary decisions that had to be adjusted. And it really was at that point that the team realized, like, we have to come together on this because we're now going in a very different direction. And that means that we have to get everyone back on at the table to let's relook at we have to look at our protocol again. We have to look at it again. Does it make sense? So that's, working with the clinical development team. We had to get ClinOps back in the room. Like, we're executing on a trial now. So we need to figure out what that looks like. We have to bring on data management. We have to consider PV. And so it almost kind of brought the team back together because previously it was like, all right, we made this decision. This is our corporate strategy. We're going in one direction. But it was quite motivating to see the team come together that quickly. But I think it was due to a lot of really good leadership, giving the team some agility and also the leeway to say, hey, we're pivoting now. This is scary, but let's buckle up and look at what our options are together, and we can make good decisions. We should be glad we got this feedback now. We should be glad that we didn't take that step with this platform, and let's motivate around this new goal.
If I could summarize some of that and maybe add a little color as well, it sounds like the key theme here is, as we're defining these critical outcomes and these key milestones, we need to prepare scenarios for the things within our control, but also provide the flexibility and the agility within the disciplines and the team and the people that we're really building our organizations on to ensure that we can prepare for the evolution and for the variables outside of our control. So that might be a regulator, that might be a payer, that might be feedback from the medical community, that might be feedback from patients. That could be investors. There's so many different variables that are not in the primary control. And these outcomes and these milestones that we're defining, they need to be clear enough that the team can rally around them and come together to work against them. But we also need to enable the flexibility for that evolution and for future iterations, knowing that things are going to change and the industry is changing, and the industry is changing quickly, and we need to be able to adapt. And the companies that are going to do well and the biotechs that are going to grow and that are going to achieve their corporate goals are the ones that can maintain that level of flexibility early on, and they know how to adapt to the changing dynamics of the market.
Part of that, Kim, is like being adjustable, is having the right team around you, right? And I think one of the other points we wanted to talk about today was having the right skills around the table to execute on milestones and be comfortable when these things change. And that does take a very kind of skilled, seasoned person, but it also takes people who have the right skills at the right time, right? And I think that for the scenario I was describing, we had a lot of great people who were they were builders. They were people who had put in the work and know, okay, so we have to make a strong turn, and that means that we need to pick up the phone and call CROs tomorrow. And how do we do that? And how quickly can we execute on that? And who do I need to call? So having those I would say, builders as well as operators around is really critical. So having those skill sets, and not just skill set of a discipline per se, but skill set of mind, like your mindset is a little bit different. And you have to be willing and able to pivot around a new strategy when it comes your way from, like you said, regulators, investors, business. It's like the last episode said, the change is going to keep happening. It's just a question of how you can pivot around it.
I think this skill piece, and especially in early biotech, is really challenging because there's a lot of fantastic experience in the market. And a lot of it and a lot of the people and the backgrounds they bring will translate really well to this very agile environment. But not everybody's interested in the ride. Not everyone, is excited to wake up and deal with the fact that they don't know what the next day brings in a biotech. And it really is a specific, it's a culture and environment that comes with this industry, and the flexibility required to really excel at it and appreciate it. And so it's important to think about, how do we develop those skills in people that have all these great experiences that we would love to bring to bear, but how do we apply it in this industry that is rapidly changing and get to a more multidisciplinary approach as we're really building organizations on these key milestones.
I think the skill sets are, the talent pool is growing, certainly. It is more common to interview people who have a lot more biotech experience and who have seen things done a lot of different ways. But you're right. It's about, finding those multidisciplinary people who have maybe played a couple different roles. And those seem to be really great folks to have when you're in your corner when change happens.
Absolutely. And, if we think about guests that we've had on the show, even over the last year, many of them are telling their story. I did a stint here. I tested this out. The company evolved and I shifted into this other role. I think the people who are really business builders in biotech tend to have careers of doing a lot of different things or wearing a lot of different hats, because that is a natural inclination for the kinds of skills and the talent that really build up the space. And so personally, I'm excited for what 2024 has to bring to bear. Hoping that there's positive traction in the funding environment so that we can continue to grow and bring really amazing therapies to patients that are clearly in need. And I think as partners to the industry and embedded in organizations that we work with, we're really thinking about this multidisciplinary approach and how do we recognize the benefits across skills, across functions, across teams and people, and really bring to bear the best of breed across that. So looking forward to all that's to come, and I appreciate the conversation today, Adriana. Thanks for joining.
Yeah, likewise, Kim. Thanks for having me.
Thanks for tuning in to the Emerging Biotech Leader, an SSI Strategy podcast. Join us each month for more conversations with biotech leaders. If you'd like to help navigating the complexities of biotech, reach out to our team at ssistrategy.com. Don't forget to hit subscribe and leave a review.